Today, we're partnering up with Mark from Plant-Based Mail to show you how to inoculate logs at home using mycelium dowels and sawdust so that you can grow your own mushrooms for years to come. I'll leave it for Mark to take it from here.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome to Inner City Permaculture, which is an urban microfarm 10 kilometres from Sydney CBD. I'm very excited to be working with Rootlab to inoculate these hardwood logs with mycelium dowels so that way I can grow an abundance of mushrooms for years and years. But first, I'm going to take you for a tour of our garden. So just steps from our doorstep is our beehive, and it's positioned in a rockery which has multi-levels of tiers. The purpose of those tiers is to slow down the flow of water through the space, which enables us to grow lots of different vegetation, flowers for our bees to extract the pollen to create honey for us. And down the bottom of the stairs here is where we're growing all of our fruits and vegetables. It's the real powerhouse of the garden. And that's only on 200 square meters. Okay, so come with me as we enter the garden. So we're gonna take a right here, and we're gonna show you where we grew 27 kilos of ginger and turmeric last year. They're the perfect place to grow ginger and turmeric. The reason being, it's nestled under a tree, so there's plenty of shade. The bed stays moist because of the tiered layers that we were describing. So the water will come down from the top of the property and slowly leach its way down and keep these beds moist. These two beds here, this is actually a water tank that was cut in half. We've been growing coriander, parsley, and now it's going to turn into our tomato beds over the hotter months. We've got 2 worm farms here, which we put kitchen scraps in. This grapevine is about 2 years old, and it's already taken over this entire space. It's grown all the way up. The plan was to grow it along the fence, but it had different ideas. It's gone all the way up into this callistemon tree. But that's life, isn't it? So this is the powerhouse of our garden. We've got 10 garden beds that we grow a variety of produce through. We love our vertical growing because it's a way of increasing the square meters of grow space. So for example, this bean is going to be growing all the way up this trellis here. We've also got zucchinis, cucumbers, our leeks, basil, silver beet, kale, tomatoes, even more beans, chilies, eggplant, all in this area. So we've got another archway here that we use to grow our Madagascar beans. It's a very vigorous grower. And then over on this side, we have our PVC wicking bed, which we're using to grow strawberries. We'll be positioning our mushroom logs underneath this elderberry tree, which will give it plenty of shade. And we've got a sprinkler set up, which will give it plenty of water. So that way the logs will be in dark and they'll also be moist. This is our chicken coop. It runs all the way down the back fence. We've got 6 chickens, and we collect our fresh eggs every day from here. Here's 2 to go. Today we're going to be talking about 2 different methods on how to inoculate logs. We're going to be talking about what size we cut our logs to. We're also going to talk about what tree species are best for which variety of mushrooms to ensure that you end up with an abundance of mushrooms growing at your place.
We're also going to talk about what tree species to avoid, when to inoculate your logs, the different parts of a log, when to cut down trees for mushroom cultivation, post-inoculation care, storing unused spawn, harvesting your mushrooms, and interesting facts about mushrooms.
Growing mushrooms on a log is a very rewarding experience, especially if you have access to acreage where there's plenty of timber and wooded areas growing. Not only does it provide an ability to have access to an abundance of delicious mushrooms, but you're also going to increase the biodiversity of the environment that it's growing in. It goes without saying that not all mushrooms grow on logs, only wood-loving varieties. So what if you don't have access to acreage and tons of logs? Well, the best way to do it, especially in an urban setting like where I am, is to discuss with your local arborist. An arborist is a professional who cuts down trees for a living, and they're more than happy to give you access to these logs because you're doing them a service, you're saving them money, especially on dumping fees. A perfect example was recently my neighbour fell a mulberry tree, and when they were cutting that down, I struck up a conversation with the arborist, and they were very happy to give me long sections of timber to be used for mushroom inoculation. If you've tried contacting a local arborist and you haven't been able to access any logs, don't be disheartened because you can definitely grow culinary mushrooms at home in buckets and in bags. So let's talk about the different varieties of trees. Hardwood trees are angiosperms that produce seeds encased within a fruit. They have broad leaves and they're typically deciduous, which means they shed their leaves annually. Hardwood trees are more dense than softwood trees because they grow slower. Some examples of hardwood trees are oak, beech and birch. Our preference is that you grow on hardwood trees because you're going to get a better yield and it's going to enhance the flavour. So let's talk about softwood trees. Softwood trees are gymnosperms that produce seeds that are not enclosed in a fruit, often in a cone. Softwood trees are typically evergreen, which means that they retain their leaves year-round. Examples include cedar, redwood and pine. Softwood logs contain resins and terpenes which can inhibit mycelium growth, which is why we don't suggest you inoculate a softwood log. It's a different story when you use softwood sawdust though, because those compounds may have been broken down. There are also soft hardwood varieties such as willow, poplar and silver wattle. These varieties also can be used to grow mushrooms. However, we would recommend using an oyster variety because they're less nutritionally demanding. We don't grow mushroom on softwood such as pine. Generally speaking, we don't grow mushrooms on fruit trees such as apple or aromatic wood varieties such as camphor laurel or rot-resistant varieties such as ironbark. I'll leave it to Chris from Rootlab to explain a little bit more.
I'm going to expand a little bit more on the different types of trees we can grow mushrooms on, what species of mushrooms we can grow on those trees, and what trees to avoid. Firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how in some cases you can use softwood for mushroom cultivation. Although softwood is typically not recommended for log-based mushroom cultivation, some growers have had success using softwood sawdust pellets, particularly for certain mushroom species. The production of wood pellets involves high heat and pressure, which can break down or reduce some of the resins and terpenes found in softwood. This process may make the substrate more conducive to mushroom growth compared to raw softwood sawdust. Certain mushroom species, especially types of oyster mushrooms, may be more tolerant of the compounds found in softwood. There's a potential for these species to grow despite the presence of residual resins and terpenes. Some growers may use a combination of softwood and hardwood pellets, which could reduce the negative effects of softwood while still offering a cost-effective substrate option. Adding nutrient-rich supplements like wheat bran or soy pellets to the substrate can help address the nutritional limitations of softwood and promote better mushroom growth. Monocots such as palm, yucca or banana are neither softwood or hardwood. Lion's mane or Hericium erinaceus grow best on certain hardwoods like oak, beech and maple. They can also thrive on chestnut, hornbeam, sweet gum, sycamore, walnut and birch. Oak will support the growth of all mushrooms except for Namiko. When selecting a mushroom species for stump decomposition, oyster mushrooms are an excellent choice because they colonize and decompose quickly compared to other species of mushroom. For a comprehensive breakdown of both heartwood and sapwood, which we'll explain a little bit more about later on in the video, hen of the woods and reishi are highly effective options. Turkey tail mushrooms are also particularly recommended, specifically because turkey tail have a longer mushroom life cycle than most other mushroom species. Most mushroom species will grow and decompose in 7 days. Turkey tail mushrooms, however, will stay for months, giving you a larger window to harvest. Remember, turkey tail mushrooms are medicinal. They are edible, however they're not palatable. Turkey tail prefer to grow on hardwood trees such as oak, maple, beech, alder and birch. However, you may still have success on some softwood varieties. It's recommended to have a few logs with varying species of mushrooms that prefer different fruiting temperatures to get mushrooms all year round. For example, blue pearl oyster and lion's mane grow in spring, winter and autumn, whereas pink, yellow and warm white oyster grow in summer. Trees that are not recommended to grow mushrooms on are pine, cedar, redwood, cypress, spruce, fir, hemlock, teak and black locust. It's time to talk about eucalyptus trees. Here in Australia, eucalyptus trees are abundant, so it will be unwise not to utilise them. While eucalyptus is an aromatic species, which we've previously advised against using, there are certain eucalyptus species that can be used for cultivation. It's important to note, however, we can only use these for growing shiitake mushrooms. All other species we won't be able to grow on eucalyptus. It's not that eucalyptus can't support the growth of other mushrooms, but shiitake are primary decomposers. This means that they are the first to break down the wood in nature, followed by secondary and tertiary fungi that colonize the tree after the shiitake has consumed it. Shiitake only consumes sapwood, leaving heartwood intact, whereas most other mushrooms consume both sapwood and heartwood. We'll get into a little bit more detail later on. However, sapwood contains fewer toxic compounds since most of the oils and toxins are concentrated in the heartwood. When selecting a log for shiitake cultivation, ensure it has more sapwood than heartwood. Additionally, shiitake struggle to colonize logs that are saturated with water, so it's best to use logs that are slightly drier. Let's talk about when to inoculate the logs. You'll know the logs are ready for inoculation when small cracks start to appear at the ends. You're looking for hairline cracks to appear, don't wait for larger cracks to form. The drying process can take 3 to 4 weeks depending on your climate. Shiitake are the only mushroom species where you wait before inoculating. For most other species, we prefer to inoculate logs immediately after cutting them down. Another mushroom species to be careful of is mycelium. For this mushroom, it's best to use treated wood. It's recommended to boil or steam the wood before inoculation because mycelium is sensitive to contamination. Being a weed competitor, mycelium can easily be taken over by bacteria or contamination that grows faster. If you're inoculating logs from anti-rot tree species that are naturally resistant to fungi, waiting 2 to 3 weeks before inoculating can help break down some of the compounds in the wood. However, keep in mind, leaving logs uninoculated for too long increases the risk of contamination from competing fungi varieties, so it's essential to store them properly. Ideally above ground, covered with something like a log blanket. Allowing the eucalyptus logs to dry out also helps to dissipate many of the toxic oils found in the wood, helping to improve its suitability for mushroom cultivation. This process is known as curing. While stomach discomfort from consuming shiitake grown on eucalyptus is rare, starting with small amounts and gradually increasing consumption is advisable to ensure that you're not sensitive to it. Now that we've covered everything about growing on eucalyptus, let's break down the different parts of a log. First, we're going to talk about the bark. This is the outermost layer of the tree, serving as protection against environmental stresses like moisture loss, temperature fluctuations, and pests. It consists of 2 parts, the outer bark, which is made up of dead cells, and the inner bark, also known as phloem, which transports nutrients throughout the tree. One thing to note, lichen won't interfere with fungal growth, so there's no need to worry about it. Leaving the bark on the wood will help to retain moisture, which is especially important in drier regions. However, if the bark is infested with ants or insects, it should be removed. Bark is also the first part of the log to decay, so if your log has been sitting for weeks and the bark shows signs of rot, it's best to remove it because bacteria from rot can compete with fungi and affect sapwood, which is the layer beneath the bark. Additionally, if drilling holes through the bark becomes difficult, removing it may be necessary. When working with eucalyptus logs, it's ideal to cut them when they naturally shed their bark in summer. There's a few reasons why eucalyptus shed their bark. As the tree grows, their trunks expand, causing the outer bark to crack and peel away. This allows for trunk expansion, revealing fresh and often brightly coloured bark beneath. Shedding their bark also helps to regulate their temperature during the hotter months by reflecting more sunlight and preventing overheating. This is also known as the exfoliation process, which helps to rid the tree of parasites, fungi, moss, and lichen that may accumulate on the outer bark, contributing negatively to the overall health of the tree. The next part of the log we're going to talk about is called sapwood. Sapwood is the living outer layer of the wood just beneath the bark. It plays a vital role in transporting water and nutrients from the roots to the leaves. Sapwood is typically lighter in colour and contains living cells that store energy reserves. This is the layer primary decomposing fungi would ideally like to use as a food source. The next part of the log is called heartwood. Located at the centre of the trunk, heartwood consists of non-living cells. As the tree ages, sapwood cells die and transform into heartwood, which provides structure and support for the tree. Heartwood is usually darker in colour due to an accumulation of chemical compounds that make it more resistant to decay and insect attacks. The upper part of a growing tree is mostly sapwood. As the tree grows, inner sapwood cells dry out and turn into heartwood. When cutting from higher up on a tree, you'll notice it's primarily sapwood without an inner core of heartwood. So when should we cut down a tree? The ideal time to cut down trees for mushroom cultivation is mid-autumn to early spring, typically between May and September in Australia. This period provides the best chance of success, although cutting trees down outside of this window can still work. Keep in mind, however, they may not yield optimal results and will produce smaller mushrooms. The results of this is very fungus and tree species dependent. Trees cut in late winter or early spring have a higher sugar content in their sapwood, which creates a more favourable environment for mushroom mycelium to thrive. Cutting trees down during their dormant phase, which is after leaf fall in autumn but before bud break in spring, ensures that the tree's natural defences against fungal colonisation are reduced. This allows the mycelium to establish more easily. Avoid using dead, decaying or dying trees. Even if the tree died during a drought, you can't be sure when they died or what pathogens now inhabit them. As discussed earlier, for species such as eucalyptus that naturally shed their bark in summer, it's best to cut them down during that time. Now let's discuss the ideal log size to cut. The recommended log size is about 15 centimeters in diameter and 60 to 100 centimeters in length. Branches are not recommended, as they dry out too quickly and aren't worth the effort. Logs that are too long will be heavy and difficult to handle, while logs that are too short may not produce enough mushrooms. The more substrate or food, the more mushrooms you'll get, so you'll need the right balance. The size of the logs you cut also depends on how easily you can move them. You might opt for larger logs if you plan to inoculate them where they remain, or have machinery or help to move them. Keep in mind, freshly cut logs are heavy due to their high moisture content. Letting the logs dry slightly after inoculation can help make them easier to handle. Once kept at their permanent spot, they can be watered again. Can you inoculate mushroom mycelium on living trees? Most cultivated mushrooms like oyster are saprophytic, meaning they feed on dead wood rather than living trees. Fungus that feeds on living trees or insects are called parasitic. Species such as Cytherea gunnii, Cyclocybe parasitica, and beefsteak fungus are parasitic. Inoculating living trees with parasitic mushrooms isn't recommended, as the mycelium will eventually kill the tree. Now it's time for Mark to show you how to inoculate the logs.
The first method we're going to be using today to inoculate these hardwood logs is with dowels or plug spawn. To start the job, we're going to have to start by putting holes in the timber. In order to do that, we'll be using a special drill bit which has a stopper. This stopper enables you to drill exactly the depth of the dowel, so that way the dowel maintains contact with the timber. These drill bits are expensive, so as an alternative you can use an 8.5mm drill bit from Bunnings with a piece of tape to ensure that you don't go too deep. As you can see, we've put a little bit of tape around the bottom as a visual indicator of how deep we need to go based on the dowel size. It's important when drilling the first hole that you have about a 5 centimetre barrier between the cut and the first hole. So now that we have our hole, we're basically going to introduce that dowel and we're going to use a rubber mallet to hammer it in, like so. But your life is going to be much easier with the special drill bit. Simply attach it to the drill and then drill away. If you want to get the job done faster, I would suggest using an angle grinder. You can get a special attachment for the special drill bit from Rootlab. You simply screw it on, then grab your special drill bit, make sure that it has a circular shank, and then using the Allen key provided, tighten like so. So now for this part of the process, the Rootlab people are insisting that I use safety equipment, but where's the fun in that? As you can see, each of the rows is offset slightly, so that way you can achieve a diamond shape in the log. This is why it's so important to have a tight fit on your dowels when you're putting it into the log. When you hammer it in, you can actually kill the surface mycelium, so having this groove enables the mycelium to safely travel from dowel to log. We're going to start putting our dowels in, or the holes. That's it. So now we hammer it in. Perfect. So now it's time to seal these dowels in with wax, and we can use food grade paraffin wax, we can use cheese wax, beeswax or soy wax. This will protect the mycelium from any contamination or pests. So to melt our wax, we're using an old camp stove and a pot. This pot already had some wax in it from a previous job, but we're just going to add a little bit more just to show you what to do. Simply add your wax to the pot and we want to have the flame on a low flame so that way it doesn't burn. We want the wax to slowly melt and not boil. So this is a wax applicator, also known as a dauber. We're going to be using this to gather up the wax and apply it over our holes. So we're just going to give each hole a generous amount of wax, just so that way we make a nice seal around it. And as you can see, the wax is changing color as it hardens. That's it.
It's important to have rows of holes that you have inoculated and sealed off that go around the whole log to fully colonize it.
So once you've inoculated the whole log, it's important to write the type of mushroom that you'll be growing on here and the date for future reference. The one that we're growing on this log is actually a lion's mane, and it's November 24. This is a heat-tolerant strain of lion's mane, which is excellent for the Australian climate.
There's no need to put wax on the end of the log. Leaving it like this is perfectly fine. The second method of inoculating logs is using hardwood sawdust colonized with mycelium.
Something very important to note when using sawdust spawn is it comes very soft. Rootlab will send you the spawn when it's colonized only 60% of the bag, so it's important not to order it too far in advance, or this sawdust spawn will become hard as a rock. We want it to be nice and soft and brittle, like this, so that way we can use our inoculation tool to easily extract the sawdust spawn. This time we're going to use a 12.5mm hex shank drill bit. So this drill bit comes with a stopper, and this will drill to a depth of 3 centimeters. So if you don't have access to this special drill bit, you can just use a standard one from Bunnings that's 12.5mm and to a depth of 3 centimeters using the tape. So let's get to it. So this is the sawdust inoculation tool. It's designed to fit into a 12.5mm hole, which is why we used that drill bit before, and it works very simply. So I'm going to take my tool, bang it in a couple of times so that way it's nicely packed, and then go over to my hole, press the button, and I'm inoculating the hole. And then I just repeat that for all of the holes in this log. Now that we've added the sawdust spawn, it's time to seal it using the wax. Just as we use sawdust spawn and plug spawn today, mycelium also comes in other forms, such as liquid culture form and grain spawn, but we can't use these for logs. Now that we've inoculated our logs, it's going to take approximately 6 to 24 months for the mycelium to colonize it, and then we'll start seeing the fruit form when the season's right. And you'll get the fruits of your labor for 5 to 8 years once it starts fruiting. If you want to eat mushrooms throughout the year, the recommendation is you have 10 logs per adult.
Let's talk about post-inoculation care during the colonization period. During this period, we want to keep the logs consistently moist by watering them regularly to support the growth of mycelium. Ensure the logs are shielded from direct sunlight, pests, and wildlife. We also want to regularly monitor the logs for any damage from pests or weather. You can keep your logs indoors during the colonization period, however keep in mind you'll need to bring them outdoors after 6 to 9 months. This will give your mushrooms the best chance of survival if pests are an issue. Keep in mind though, it's difficult to water your logs indoors. Using a log blanket can also help keep them protected from pests and weather. Additionally, you can put them on a raised structure. If logs are stored outdoors under a tree, natural rainfall may be enough in some regions. However, in areas with intense sunlight or hot summers, logs may dry out faster and require more frequent watering. Periodic deep watering is more effective than frequent light watering. You can soak the logs for a day or hose them down for 10 to 15 minutes weekly or every few weeks. If you notice the logs starting to shrivel, this indicates they need more moisture. Most mushroom species are forgiving if you forget to water them. Just rehydrate them when you notice they've dried out. Keep in mind, logs will only absorb as much water as they need, so overwatering them isn't a major concern. However, you may want to avoid keeping the surrounding areas consistently wet or waterlogged, as this can hinder mushroom growth as it can attract pests, termites, competing fungi, and bacteria. One way to know for certain that logs need water is when large cracks start to form, big enough that you can put a 20-cent piece inside. It's not recommended to let the logs reach this level, as it can crack from the middle and mycelium can dry off much faster due to the increased surface area where evaporation can take place. Now let's talk about the storage and handling of unused plug spawn and sawdust. We want to store the unused plug spawn and sawdust spawn in the refrigerator. However, pink oyster are cold sensitive and should be used immediately. Plug spawn and sawdust spawn remain viable for 2 to 3 months when refrigerated. However, it's best used within 2 months. Use a bag sealing clip or a heat sealer to reseal any open bags. Sawdust spawn comes in 3 kilogram bags. If you're only inoculating a small number of logs, it might be best to open the sawdust spawn bag and take out the required quantity of spawn and reseal the bag with a bag sealing clip or a heat sealer. This will prevent the remaining spawn from getting contaminated. Let's talk about harvesting your mushrooms. Fruiting begins when the environmental conditions such as temperature and humidity are ideal. Logs can produce mushrooms from 3.5 to 7 years. This depends on factors like mushroom variety, log size, watering practices, temperature, humidity of the surrounding areas, tree species, and the time the tree was cut. Always properly identify the mushrooms before consuming them. Only harvest mushrooms from logs that you have labelled properly or at least can identify. For varieties like oyster mushrooms, twist the entire cluster to pull them off. Harvest the mushroom when the cap bends downward. If they start to curve upwards, their shelf life decreases dramatically. This is because they sporulate, which negatively affects the texture, flavour, and increases vulnerability to wildlife damage. Let's talk about a few interesting facts about mushrooms. It has long been part of Japanese folklore that lightning storms can boost mushroom production. Modern science has actually confirmed this. There are studies showing that artificial lightning strikes can significantly increase the yield of shiitake mushrooms. When logs inoculated with shiitake mycelium are exposed to electrical discharges, the shockwaves from the strikes break the hyphae, which are the vegetative filaments, triggering the mycelium to enter their reproductive phase and produce more fruiting bodies. The theory behind this is that the mycelium interprets the electric shock as a danger signal, prompting it to reproduce quickly by producing mushrooms. This is because mushrooms are the reproductive structures of fungi, and in stressful conditions they may accelerate reproduction to ensure survival. Cold shock may also trigger fruiting. Many mushrooms, especially those grown on logs like shiitake, respond to cold shock after winter by initiating fruiting. You can also do this artificially to trigger mushrooms to fruit. Doing this mimics natural season changes, where a drop in temperature signals to the fungi that it is time to reproduce before conditions become too harsh. Farmers often simulate this by soaking the logs in cold water or exposing them to colder temperatures to trigger mushroom growth.
So we've positioned our logs underneath the elderberry. It's in a shaded part of the garden. We've got our sprinkler system set up ready to go, and these will sit here for at least 6 months waiting for the mycelium to colonise those logs, and then we'll see plenty of fruit for years to come. That's it for this video, but if you want to follow me and our garden journey, you can find us on Instagram at PlantBasedMale.
Thanks Mark for all your help with this video. You can find our log inoculation blog post on our website in the learning section, which will be updated to keep relevant as time goes on. And I hope you guys enjoy growing your own mushrooms on logs at home. Give this video a like and subscribe to see more.